Amaka was 27, and to anyone watching from the outside, her life looked like a painting of perfection, bold strokes of ambition, bright colors of laughter, and a golden frame of youthful success. She worked as a banker in the heart of Lagos, always dressed in crisp suits that whispered of confidence and heels that clicked like a rhythm of destiny across marble floors. Every morning she would weave through traffic with music in her ears, her eyes set on skyscrapers, her heart pounding with the dreams of promotions, new cars, and maybe one day, her own home. She was beautiful, ambitious, and unshaken by fear, the kind of woman young girls admired and older women praised for having it all together. To her friends, she was a star always on the rise. To her colleagues, she was the woman who could balance 10 accounts, close ₦1 million deal, and still laugh over pepper soup at the end of the day. Yet beneath the glow of her success lay a quiet flaw. Amaka believed her youth was an unbreakable shield. Doctors' reminders about regular checkups sounded unnecessary. Health campaigns passed by like billboards on a highway, noticed but never considered. She thought sickness belonged to the weak, the aged, or the careless, not to a young woman at the peak of her strength. Routine tests? "Abeg, I'm still young," she would say with a wave of her hand, her laughter masking the silent truth. She had never done one. Her days rolled on like a golden drumbeat, steady and intoxicating. On weekends, she took selfies at lounges, sharing cocktails and jokes with friends. At home, her parents called with pride in their voices, praising the banker daughter who was making us proud in the city. Amaka felt invincible. The mirror reflected smooth skin, glowing eyes, a slim figure. What could possibly go wrong? If she ever thought of illness, it was in passing, as something that happened to strangers whose stories she scrolled past on social media. To her, hospitals were for treating malaria after rainy seasons or for pregnant women about to deliver. She never imagined she could be called into a quiet room, handed a slip of paper, and told something that would freeze her world. And so she lived as though tomorrow was guaranteed. Every salary increase became shopping trips. Every achievement became a celebration. She had Chioma, her best friend since university, who often teased her about being too careless with her health. Chioma, now a medical laboratory scientist, carried a different seriousness about life. She spoke of tests, of prevention, of women who looked fine today, but tomorrow were battling illnesses they never imagined. But Amaka would laugh it off. "Chioma, please abeg, let me enjoy my life. I'll start worrying about all those things when I turn 40. And just like that, the seeds of denial kept growing, watered by her confidence, shaded by her success. Then came the workplace health campaign, a day that looked so ordinary, yet would later stand as the turning point of her life. Flyers were pasted around the banking hall, free health screening for staff. Nurses walked in with boxes of test kits, doctors sat behind tables, and colleagues whispered excitedly about checking their health status. Amaka wasn't interested. She had reports to file, clients to call, and deadlines to beat. Besides, what tests could they possibly run that she needed? She brushed past the booth once, twice, almost pretending it wasn't there. But fate has a way of refusing to be ignored. Chioma, who had come as part of the volunteer medical team, spotted her from across the hall. Their eyes met, and Chioma's face broke into that familiar mix of joy and concern. She marched straight to Amaka, her white coat flowing, her ID card swinging, her voice carrying both affection and authority. "Amaka, don't tell me you'll walk past this chance," she said, half laughing, half serious. Amaka rolled her eyes, ready with her usual excuse, but Chioma pressed harder. She spoke of women her age, 27, 29, 31, who had come in healthy, smiling, only to discover they carried a silent threat inside their bodies. She lowered her voice, whispering of cervical cancer, of HPV, of lives cut short not because the disease was unbeatable, but because they found it too late. Amaka shifted uneasily, still unconvinced, but something in Chioma's eyes, an urgency, almost like fear, made her pause. She sighed. "Fine, just to make you happy. But I swear nothing is wrong with me." She picked up the form, scribbled her details, and walked to the examination room. It was a simple process, so simple, in fact, that Amaka wondered why Chioma made such a fuss. She lay on the table, the doctor spoke calmly, inserted a speculum, took a swab, and it was over. No pain, no drama, just a few minutes of mild discomfort. She laughed as she walked out, joking with her colleagues about how easy and unnecessary it all felt. To her, it was just another errand crossed off her list. She didn't think about the samples being sealed, labeled, and sent to the lab. She didn't think about the possibility that within those cells lay a secret her glowing skin and confident smile could not reveal. She didn't imagine that in just a few days, her name would be called in a quiet voice, her hands would tremble over a white envelope, and her entire world would be rewritten. For now, Amaka was still in the golden days, walking back to her desk with laughter on her lips, completely unaware that her life was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a single result to push it over. The days after the workplace campaign carried on like every other day for Amaka. She woke early, dressed in her tailored skirts and blouses, and walked into the bank with her smile that melted clients' worries. She had almost forgotten about the test, until the morning a message buzzed on her phone. Your HPV test result is ready. Kindly report to the health desk. For a moment, she frowned. It felt unnecessary. Why couldn't they just send her a text that said, all clear? With the arrogance of someone certain nothing could be wrong, she delayed the visit, attended to her files, and even cracked jokes with colleagues. But something in her spirit, tiny, uneasy, kept whispering. Finally, in the afternoon, she walked to the small consulting room where the medical team sat. The nurse looked up, her face too calm, too professional. Miss Amaka, please have a seat. That was the first sign. The room felt colder than the air conditioner could explain. The doctor cleared his throat and spoke gently. Your test shows you are positive for a high-risk strain of HPV. For a moment, the words floated like smoke in the air, meaningless. Positive? High risk? HPV. Amaka blinked, waiting for the punchline, the correction, something. But the doctor's eyes were steady, his voice calm, rehearsed from saying this too many times. It does not mean you have cancer, he continued. But it does mean you are at higher risk if it is not monitored and treated on time. His words fell like stones into her chest. She heard cancer, she heard risk, she heard not normal. Her ears buzzed, her heart pounded, and suddenly the walls felt too close. She left the room in silence, clutching the envelope as though it were a death sentence. Outside, the sun still shone, cars still honked, colleagues still laughed, but her world had tilted. She wanted to run, to scream, to rewind time to the moment before Chioma persuaded her. Shame crept in like a shadow. What if people found out? Would they look at her differently? Would whispers follow her in the office, branding her with a sickness she barely understood? That night, she sat on her bed staring at the ceiling, the word positive replaying in her mind like a drumbeat. She Googled HPV high risk, scrolling through stories of cervical cancer, surgeries, and early deaths. Her hands shook, her eyes blurred with tears, her stomach twisted with fear. She thought of her parents. How could she ever tell them? She thought of future relationships. What man would love a woman carrying this kind of news? And so she did what many young women do when fear meets stigma. She folded the result, tucked it into a drawer, and promised herself silence. Weeks passed, and silence became her mask. On the outside, Amaka was still the radiant banker, the one who smiled at clients, bought new shoes, and laughed at office jokes. But inside, she carried a storm. She avoided Chioma, dodging her calls and messages, afraid her friend would insist on follow-ups. At night, she cried into her pillow, asking God, why me? Sometimes she convinced herself the result was wrong, that labs make mistakes, that maybe the doctor had mixed up names. But whenever she looked at the envelope in her drawer, reality stared back. She prayed the symptoms would never come. She told herself if she ignored it long enough, maybe it would vanish like smoke. But the body has its own truth, and silence does not erase danger, it feeds it. And so the months crept by, carrying her deeper into denial. Then one morning, while dressing for work, Amaka noticed a strange discomfort she could not ignore. It was subtle at first, slight bleeding outside her cycle, an unusual discharge, an ache she brushed off as stress. But in her heart, alarm bells rang. She remembered the doctor's words. It does not mean you have cancer, but it must be monitored. Her chest tightened, her legs weakened. Her reflection in the mirror looked suddenly fragile. Fear gripped her again, fiercer this time, whispering, "You thought you had time. You thought youth was protection. But the storm is coming." For the first time since the result, she realized denial would not save her. The silence she had clung to was breaking, and behind it loomed a battle she could no longer avoid. The discomfort grew like a whisper that refused to be silenced. At first, Amaka told herself it was nothing, a stress-induced imbalance, maybe the effect of late nights at the bank, or even a harmless infection that would disappear with rest. But the body does not lie. Each week brought a new signal, irregular spotting, fatigue that drained her sparkle, a dull ache that sat stubbornly in her lower abdomen. She carried on her routines with painted smiles, but her confidence was cracking. Her colleagues still saw the vibrant banker in elegant suits, but behind the mirror at night, Amaka saw a young woman haunted by shadows only she could feel. Each time she opened her drawer and caught a glimpse of that folded test result, guilt pressed heavily on her chest. She wanted to burn it, to erase its existence, but some part of her held on, as though destroying the paper would not undo the truth it carried. Silence was her cage, and shame was the lock that kept her trapped. Chioma noticed the change before anyone else did. Best friends have a way of seeing what others miss. She saw the dark circles forming under Amaka's eyes, the way her laughter was shorter, her excuses more frequent. When her calls were dodged and her visits rejected, she grew restless. One evening, unannounced, she appeared at Amaka's flat, her white lab coat swapped for a simple blouse, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. Amaka tried to put on her usual brave face, but one look from Chioma, and the facade collapsed. Tears came pouring, words tumbling. The test result, the silence, the fear of being judged, the symptoms she could no longer ignore. Chioma listened, her eyes soft but firm, her voice carrying the weight of truth. Amaka, I know it's scary, but hiding from it won't change it. Early care can save your life. You're not alone in this. Please, let's go to the hospital. Amaka resisted at first, shame still whispering its poison. But Chioma's hand over hers, steady and warm, broke the chain of denial. For the first time in months, Amaka breathed, not freely, but honestly, admitting that she needed help. The hospital visits began, each one a battle of courage. The first consultation was the hardest. Sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by women of all ages, Amaka felt exposed. She feared every pair of eyes knew her secret, that the whispers were about her. But when the doctor welcomed her in, his voice calm, his tone reassuring, something inside her softened. Tests were ordered, examinations done, and slowly, a treatment and monitoring plan was drawn up. The medical terms were heavy, colposcopy, biopsy, lesion, but Chioma was there to translate, to hold her hand, to remind her that knowledge was not a curse but a weapon. Still, the journey was not without storms. There were days when Amaka broke down in tears, days when she questioned her worth, nights when loneliness wrapped around her tighter than any blanket. Some friends, when they found out, distanced themselves, their ignorance turning into judgment. A relationship she had been nurturing quietly fizzled out. The young man withdrew, unable to handle what he did not understand. The losses cut deep, but beneath the pain was a stubborn flame. Amaka wanted to live. And so she fought. She swallowed her fears alongside her medicines, attended her appointments, followed her doctor's instructions with discipline. On weekends when others partied, she read stories of survivors, drawing strength from women who turned their pain into purpose. She prayed, cried, and prayed again. Her faith became her anchor, Chioma her shield, and every small victory, normal test results, manageable symptoms, encouraging words, became stepping stones out of the pit of despair. By the end of that year, Amaka was no longer the same carefree banker who had laughed off routine checks. She was scarred, yes, but also sharpened by fire. She was learning resilience, patience, and courage in ways she never imagined. The storm had not passed, but she had found her footing. Yet even as she gained strength, she knew her story was just beginning, for survival was only one chapter. The greater challenge was what she would do with her scars, and whether she would keep her voice silent or let it rise as a warning to others. The hospital became a second home, a place Amaka once feared but now depended on like a lighthouse in a raging storm. Every visit carried its own rhythm, the cold corridors echoing with footsteps, the quiet hum of machines, the smell of disinfectant that clung stubbornly to her clothes. At first, walking in felt like walking into a battlefield with no armor. But gradually, she began to see it as a sanctuary of second chances. The doctors explained every step, sometimes in words that felt heavy with dread, but Chioma's presence translated them into hope. "This is not the end," her best friend would whisper. "This is just the beginning of your healing." Amaka clung to those words. The treatments were not easy. There were days her body felt like it had been drained of all energy, nights when she curled into herself, sobbing quietly as the fear of cancer hovered like a shadow. But every time she felt too weak to go on, she remembered the faces of women in the waiting room, some older, some younger, all fighting battles like hers. Their eyes carried the same mix of fear and determination, and in their silent solidarity, she found courage. Her journey was not just medical, it was deeply emotional. The stigma of HPV and cervical conditions weighed on her like an invisible burden. Some colleagues whispered behind her back when they noticed her frequent hospital visits. One day, she overheard a comment that cut deep. "She looks fine on the outside, but you never know what people are hiding." The words replayed in her mind for weeks, fueling her insecurities. A relationship she had once cherished collapsed entirely when she confided in her partner. His fear overpowered his love, and he walked away without looking back. Amaka's heart broke, but in the fragments, she found a fierce resolve. "If my truth scares you away, then you were never strong enough to walk this path with me," she told herself. Loneliness became a familiar companion, but so did strength. She learned to draw power from solitude, to remind herself that healing was not just about her body, it was about reclaiming her spirit. Slowly, progress began to show. The medical reports grew less alarming, the symptoms less frequent. Her doctors praised her consistency, reminding her that early intervention was saving her life. Chioma's constant encouragement became a lifeline. She never missed an appointment with Amaka, never let her sink too deep into despair. Together, they prayed before every procedure, their hands clasped tightly as though their faith could hold back the darkness. Amaka also began journaling, writing down every fear, every victory, every silent cry, and in those pages she discovered her voice. "One day, I will tell my story," she scribbled. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. That promise became her anchor. It pulled her through the worst nights, when nightmares of hospital beds and cancer wards haunted her sleep, when she doubted whether the struggle was worth it. With every passing month, she grew stronger, not just physically but emotionally. By the time 2 years had passed, Amaka was no longer defined by her diagnosis. She was defined by her resilience. She had walked through fire and emerged not unscarred, but unbroken. Her laughter returned, softer now, touched with wisdom. Her eyes carried a depth that only those who have stared at mortality could understand. She was still the ambitious banker, still the daughter who made her parents proud, but now she was something more, a woman forged by trials, armed with knowledge, and driven by a mission bigger than herself. And as she closed her journal one evening after another clear medical report, she whispered the same words again. "One day, I will tell my story." What she did not yet know was that her story would soon become a torch for many others, a light that would lead women out of silence and into the power of early testing. When Amaka first stepped onto the small stage of a community hall to share her story, her hands trembled so much she thought she might drop the microphone. The hall was filled with young women, mothers, and even men who had come out for a free health awareness seminar. She looked at their faces, curious, expectant, skeptical, and for a brief moment, the old fear threatened to choke her words. But then, she remembered the nights of endless tears, the cruel whispers at her workplace, the moment her partner abandoned her, and the countless hours in cold hospital rooms fighting for her future. She took a deep breath, lifted her head, and spoke with a voice steadier than she imagined possible. "My name is Amaka," she began, "and 2 years ago, I thought my life was over when I tested positive for a high-risk strain of HPV. But today, I stand here alive, stronger, and more determined than ever. I am here to tell you that early testing can save your life." The silence in the hall was deafening, but soon the silence turned into nods, tears, and an unspoken connection that reached every soul present. From that day forward, Amaka's life took on a new rhythm. Weekends were no longer about rest, but about traveling to schools, churches, markets, and community centers. She told her story with raw honesty, describing the shame she once felt and the strength she eventually found. Women began lining up to talk to her privately after her sessions, sharing their own fears and secrets. Some had never even heard of HPV testing before. Amaka listened, hugged them, and encouraged them to take the step she once resisted. Slowly, her voice grew beyond small gatherings. Health organizations began inviting her as a guest speaker. Her face appeared on local television programs, and her words spread across social media platforms. She wasn't just telling a story anymore. She was leading a movement. Every time she stood in front of an audience, she carried the weight of the women who had no one to speak for them, the ones who waited too long, and the ones who never got a second chance. But not all stories had a hopeful ending, and those haunted Amaka the most. Some of her colleagues from the bank, the very ones who laughed off the health campaign years earlier, were not so fortunate. One in particular, a vibrant young woman named Ifeoma, had brushed aside the test, insisting she was too healthy to be worried. Months later, Ifeoma collapsed at work and was diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. Amaka visited her in the hospital, holding her frail hand as tears streamed down both their faces. "I should have listened," Ifeoma whispered, regret dripping from every word. That moment carved itself into Amaka's heart like a scar. She realized that advocacy was not just about awareness, it was about urgency. Every delay, every excuse, could mean the difference between life and death. From then on, her voice carried a sharper edge, her message burned with more intensity. Don't wait until it is too late. Test now. Protect your tomorrow. Her mission transformed her entire identity. She was no longer just Amaka the banker. She became Amaka the advocate, the survivor, the voice for countless silent battles. Newspapers called her the courageous voice against cervical cancer. Women she had never met before would stop her in public to thank her for inspiring them to get tested. Some even credited her with saving their lives. With every story of survival that reached her ears, she felt a deep, unshakable joy, proof that her pain had not been in vain. Yet she knew the fight was far from over. For every woman who got tested early, there were still many more trapped in fear, ignorance, or stigma. And so, she kept pushing, kept speaking, kept standing in the gap. Her journey, once born out of personal tragedy, had now become a blazing torch lighting the path for others. And though the weight was heavy, Amaka carried it proudly, for she had learned one undeniable truth. Sometimes your greatest wounds become your greatest weapons. The years rolled on, and Amaka's story spread farther than she could ever have imagined. She had walked through the valley of despair, and now she stood tall as a beacon of resilience and truth. But with every step forward, the echoes of lives lost reminded her that the fight was not only personal, it was generational. She attended funerals of women who had once laughed in denial, women who dismissed HPV testing as unnecessary, and each time, the grief cut her like a fresh wound. One day, at a burial of a young mother barely in her 30s, Amaka could not hold back her tears. As the coffin was lowered, she whispered under her breath, "It could have been me." That reality pushed her harder. Every stage, every microphone, every audience became sacred ground to her. Another chance to stop a coffin from closing too soon. Another chance to rewrite a woman's story. Her advocacy was no longer a choice, it was a calling. And fate had a way of proving her point. In the very same workplace where Amaka once sat quietly as colleagues mocked her, the tables turned. A few of those who had dismissed the health campaign years earlier began showing up at hospitals with advanced conditions. Some sought her help in secrecy, their once proud voices now broken with regret. Amaka listened, not with bitterness, but with compassion. She had been mocked, abandoned, and stigmatized, yet she never let resentment take root. Instead, she saw in their pain the urgency of her mission. She told their stories in her speeches, never naming names, but painting vivid pictures of wasted chances and delayed action. The public listened. Families began to demand testing for their daughters, husbands encouraged their wives, and mothers pleaded with their children. A ripple effect had begun, and Amaka was at the center of it, a living testimony of how one story could shift an entire culture. Her impact was not measured only in speeches or campaigns, but in laws and policies that began to take shape. Inspired by her courage, NGOs partnered with government bodies to make HPV testing more affordable and accessible. Schools invited her not just to speak, but to help draft health programs for young girls. Churches, which once shied away from discussions of reproductive health, now welcomed her with open arms, recognizing that silence had killed too many daughters. And while Amaka celebrated these victories, she never forgot the loneliness of her darkest nights. Whenever she stood on a stage, she carried those memories with her, nights of crying into her pillow, days of feeling unworthy, moments when she thought her life was over. Those scars made her message authentic, and that authenticity drew people to her. She was not just a speaker, she was living proof. At last, the story came full circle. Years after that first workplace campaign, Amaka found herself once again in a corporate hall, but this time, she was the guest of honor. Rows of employees sat listening, their notebooks open, their eyes fixed on her. The same space where she once felt pressure to hide her truth had now become a platform for her voice to echo. As she concluded her talk, she looked around the room and saw not skepticism but determination. Hands went up, not to dismiss, but to ask where they could get tested. In that moment, Amaka knew she had fulfilled her mission. Her journey had begun with fear, shame, and silence, but it ended with courage, purpose, and a legacy of hope. Standing tall, she left them with the words that had become her anthem. Early testing can save your life. Don't wait until symptoms appear. Don't let fear steal your future. Take the test, embrace the truth, and choose life.